Hi, it's Dave. Thanks for tuning in to On the Ledge, the Ontario Politics podcast. Just before we get to today's episode, if you enjoy On the Ledge, it's likely you'll enjoy our daily offering. It's called Now and Next, and I co-host it with my daughter, Erin Trafford. She's the CEO at Story Studio Network, and we always bring in our producer, Becky Coles, to talk about the stories of the day, and we highlight the daily brief. Sort of a long look at some of the bigger stories of the day. And you can listen to the entire daily brief on our Supercast feed. It's nowandnext.supercast.com. You can subscribe to the feed for $10 a month, and it means two things. First, you get the full daily brief on a daily basis. You can hear Now and Next earlier than our regular post, which happens at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And we are also setting up some Ask Me Anything sessions. So if you want to know more about how it is we produce the shows or what we're looking at in terms of some of the politics or ideas or whatever it is that's on your mind, because it's an Ask Me Anything session, go to nowandnext.supercast.com and support the show. Now enjoy On the Ledge.
An original
from Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Well, welcome in. Here we go. It is the 30th day of September. It's a Friday. And it is the day for truth and reconciliation in this country. And I hear a lot of sniping about the federal employees that get the day off and how useful that is and so on. Everybody patting Tim Hortons on the back because they have orange sprinkles on their donuts. I'm not quite sure how to take that. Sol Mamakwa is the MPP for what is the largest riding in Ontario. It's almost 300,000 square kilometers. And the riding is called Kiiwetinoog. And I talked to him today, or yesterday actually, about this day of truth and reconciliation. And John Wright and Keith Leslie are here as usual. But I just want to get to Sol's comments, and then I think we need to kind of reflect on them in a serious way. Not that we wouldn't be, but he kind of puts the point on it. Keeping in mind, this is the largest riding in the province. He has to fly in to get to anything where he's going to meet with his constituents. And he talks about, the challenges of just the expanse of the riding. Never mind the challenges in First Nations communities. So I simply asked him, what would reconciliation look like for him?
Reconciliation would mean, for me, I think if the government stopped having those colonial oppressive practices, policies in place. And
Be specific. What are those?
Clean drinking water. We just want clean drinking water.
Yeah.
Like I have a community that's been on its 28th year. I said, what the hell? What the hell is that? And I think,
how patient can we be?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I think if there was a political will, they would have done those things already. And, even this fall, it's end of September, about 3-4 weeks ago, students from Flying First Nations have to leave for high school. They're 13 years old leaving high school. Where else in Ontario does that happen? People down in Southern Ontario, they're, oh yeah, my college, university students leaving. And, it's at a different level. Eh? But I think it's all part of it, right? And I think that's some of the, that's reconciliation. And I think, when we talk about the records, Indian residential school records, whether it's from the churches, Roman Catholic Church, when have they should release all their records so we can find the children that never came home. And I think, a healing initiative from the residential school trauma, because it goes down into intergenerational trauma. Because intergenerational trauma is something that, a word that we use, is a saying that we use, but also we live it on a daily basis. And you see it in different ways. Again, I spoke about the overrepresentation of Indigenous people and the correction system, the overrepresentation of children in the child welfare system. We see it. Those are the impacts. And, the whoever designed those programs in the Indian residential school, it's working exactly the way they're designed to, which is to take away the rights of our people to the lands and the resources. It's an action. It's an action right now. That's colonialism, oppression, and action. But I'll say this much as well. The more oppressed we are, the stronger we become as nations. And I think that's who we are. That we've, the intent of Indian residential school was to get rid of the Indian in a child, and they tried. And I think reconciliation could mean as well teaching the real history of Canada, the real history of Indian residential schools, and the curriculum, because the change is within the young people. The young people are rising, and they're asking why.
A lot in there, and when you hear Sol Mamakwa speak, that's about as loud as he gets. I don't know if you've had a chance to interact with him, but speaks quietly but forcefully. And John, I think he, and again, I was somewhat being glib about the orange sprinkles on the donuts at Tim Hortons today. I appreciate that people are trying to do something symbolic and step out, because the proceeds from those sales are going to go to support the Indigenous communities. But for God's sake, we've got low-hanging fruit there. 28 years, one of his communities been on a boil water order. Where the hell are we on that?
Well, I guess we are not taking it as seriously as a human right. But I do have to give credit to Mark Miller, who is the Minister of Indigenous Affairs for Canada, who on his watch has probably done more than I can recall any minister being involved with. I mean, here's a guy who in 2017 made the first speech entirely in Mohawk in the House of Commons. I mean, who has been shoulder to shoulder, even criticized his own government when being there. I mean, he's a different politician than Seamus O'Regan, when he was promising to get stuff done. This is a guy who is passionate, cooperative, shoulder to the wheel type minister. I don't know what Minister Rickford is doing in the province of Ontario. And I know that there's lots of interjurisdictional issues, but I will say this about public opinion. Public opinion was fairly benign until they found the unmarked graves. And it was an absolute sea change in this country. You could see it in the numbers. You could see it over the weekend when I was polling, and you could see the numbers changing. The awareness level, the impact on people. It was the first thing that they could literally relate to, and particularly women in this country. So there is public support for all of this. But Dave, what he said about the drinking water, it is incomprehensible to me as to why this goes on. There must be an explanation for it. But as a basic human right, I go right back to the beginning. It's something that you would send everybody to Haiti or to some other place to fix. But it just doesn't seem to get done. And I don't understand it. It's got full force of the public to get it done and to spend the billions of dollars that needs to be done. So I don't know. I don't know what you do. I don't know at this stage.
Well, Keith, we send DART into crisis areas around the world when there are typhoons and so on, and there's no drinking water. This is beyond unconscionable. It's criminal.
Well, it's also bloody ridiculous. And it's the one thing, there was so much in what Sol Mamakwa said there that we could digest. But I just want to focus on the one thing I know a little bit about, which is the water. I was writing a lot about water for the Canadian Press in 2015 and 2016 about Nestle getting, charged $3.75 for every million liters. The Six Nations are basically, next to Caledonia on the Grand River. Half of them are still having their water trucked in. This is not some remote, this is not the northern remote where we have to fly in communities and there's absolute issues, massive cost issues, getting them proper water treatment facilities and having them run and maintain all these sorts of things. We're talking in the heart of southern Ontario. So there is some good, I don't know where the political will is. The water thing is just, it's unconscionable. It's unexplainable. Why one area, 28 years of boil water advisories. Those of us that, have gone, the odd occasion where you go a week having to boil water or something, it's so frustrating. So can you imagine your entire life? No, you have to boil every bit of water. There's no valid reason why this hasn't been done. Again, a simple solution I would think would be put it on the cost of the bottled water, put it on the cost of Nestle. Say, okay, you can have this much groundwater, but you're also going to create a filtration plant right here. You're going to create some fresh water. It's easy enough to do. We can put it on corporate. We can find the money for this. It's beyond basic human rights. It's a health. Again, and there's so many other issues on these communities. The housing issues, people living on top of each other. There's not enough housing. All these sorts of things. I don't know where to go with all of it other than to turn to some good news, which was what we heard, and we didn't get to it last week, and so it's timely that we get to talk about it this week, which is the Hydro One decision to offer First Nations affected by any new transmission line projects, electricity line projects that cost $100 million or more, 50-50 equity stake. No more individual negotiations with each group as they go along, trying to set this and then giving out, lump sum cash payment up front that never seems to get to the people that actually need it really. No, this is generational. 50-50 equity stake. As I recall, I was just mentioning Six Nations. As I recall, there's a transmission line project that comes from Niagara right up to that area and then is driven into the ground. The lines literally go into the ground because it was never completed because they never completed the negotiations. Enough of this. 50-50 equity stake from Hydro One, which, let's face it, I've roundly criticized, I think a lot of people have criticized the Liberal government for selling off the majority stake in it. It's 60% privately run, and they've come up with this. Now, I think they've come up with it based on a business case that it was costing them a fortune and not getting anything done to try case-by-case negotiations. This is a brilliant way to go, but it's also a huge change for generations of First Nations communities. It's not a one-time lump sum payment.
Well, I wonder how this was affected by the Wate Power project. If you recall, back in 2018, I got to go up to Paganchigam, which is up in Sol Mamakwa's riding, and it was about a 90-minute Dash 8 flight from Thunder Bay. So it was up there, and this was the first of 17 communities that was going to be connected to the grid for the first time in history. And the Wate Power was owned and operated by the First Nations communities in Ontario. So this was the beginning of it. And in conversation with Sol, I was talking to him about that. And by the way, you can hear the whole interview today. Later, we're going to post it in our Now and Next feed. So, and I would just encourage you as a sidebar, sit down and listen to it with the kids. I know we're in school today, but that's a conversation that you need to have. It's age appropriate, and I think it really is, to Sol's point, about having young ears hear these stories. But in that community, it was among the highest suicide rates for teenagers. And so this was a sad, sad place on the planet. And we went and toured some of the houses, and you talked about housing needs. There were people who were living on top of each other because there wasn't adequate housing, period. And when you walked in, we talk about running water. There's no plumbing because there's no running water. So the key to all of this is exactly what you're talking about, Keith, is to make sure that not only do we have power in these areas, but that they have some kind of equity in it. And there's ownership in it. And that's a resource that they can actually take advantage of and move forward. So it's really interesting to hear it against that backdrop of something that started 3 years ago, that this is the first step in terms of getting new housing, building new schools, making sure that there's some security in the communities, because right now they were relying on diesel fuel and generators, and the idea that, you communicated with each other not through a phone, but just because you had a Facebook groups set up. So we take a lot for granted in this part of the world in terms of how First Nations live in Ontario.
Oh, yes. We really have no idea. This is eye-opening to many of us. I think, as John mentioned, that the discovery of the suspected graves at the residential schools just woke a heck of a lot of Canadians up to the reality of it. They are just learning. Some people, they weren't aware of the water situations, of the housing situations. It's convenient and easy enough to ignore when it's not in your face all the time because they're so remote, many of these communities. But as I say, it's also a situation in some of the communities that are very close to major urban centers. It's at its heart, it has to be racist in its systemic issues. The policies that's created this and that have not addressed this, these drinking water. Again, we could go on and on. I want to focus on the positive, and to give credit where credit is due. Doug Ford was apparently all behind this. He signaled early on last spring that the idea of this 50-50 equity stake, no more of these individual negotiations, was a brilliant idea to get people to get this generational income and equity stake flowing. So proper credit to Doug Ford on that one.
Still on the energy file, this week, the province, John, decided that they were going to, first of all, the question was delaying the shutdown at Pickering. Now it looks like they want to refurbish it and push it out a little further. And this is pretty much a circumstance of COVID-19, I would think, because we saw so many things happen in terms of resilience and conversations around that. We've expedited our focus on climate, and that has put a real focus on the need for electric cars, all of this. And then the question became infrastructure. So it was interesting to me to see this week where the province said, not so fast. Maybe we shouldn't pull the plug on Pickering, that in fact it's more efficient and less emissions than we would otherwise need for natural gas. It's an unlikely nimble move by the province in this case.
Yeah, I suppose, except that if you eliminated that, there would have to be new build in the plan anyways, right? Like, you've got to solve the energy situation always through nuclear now. And I say that because it dwarfs everything else that we provide to people to turn the lights on. A quick story on that. About 15 years ago, I actually did all the polling for the Canadian Nuclear Association. And it was a really interesting file to be on because I took over the file when they had gone through all kinds of controversies in Ontario, and public support had dropped probably down to about 35 to 40%. And we started polling on the issue and got really deep into it. And we found a few things that were really critical at that stage. Number one, and it in hindsight, it seems so simple now, but the reality was, if you talked about it in terms of green energy and supporting the environment, it was, first of all, there was that. Number two was segmenting the population and finding the people who were most not against it, but were rather anxious about it, and trying to convince them that you actually had proper plans of safety and things like that. It tended to be undereducated women in rural areas of the province. And so there was a campaign that was specifically at that. The turning point, though, again, it was about refurbishing and new builds, and more of an emphasis on refurbishing, was when Bob Hunter of Greenpeace suddenly stood up and said nuclear is the way to go, and became an advocate, not just a spokesperson for the industry, but a true advocate. And this was not because he was getting paid. Well, he was getting paid. There's no question about that. But when I was there, before he was getting paid to go and do things, he was actually advocating that nuclear was a green solution to this. So
this was industry bullshit. I'm sorry to interrupt, but in the 1990s, I remember being at a radio television news directors meeting, and I was talking to the other news directors. I said, the whole new switch here is that the nuclear industry is portraying itself as green. It's going to be the green energy solution. They laughed at me. They literally laughed. Can never happen. That will never happen. And a decade later, they managed to just push right through. Nuclear is considered the green option. I don't believe it. They still haven't addressed the basic issues. They're still arguing about, do we need to find the site to bury this waste, where we're going to transport it to? I know there's a whole lot of other issues. The key is Ontario needs the nuclear power. I know that. But I also think that portraying nuclear energy as green is horseshit.
Well,
you can in the context of the emissions. You can in the context of emissions.
Well, look,
right?
Yes, but in the cost to build, the way you build it, you're building it. It's like cement factories, right? They're the worst polluting things on the planet.
Well, I suppose the after effect of it is something that the Nuclear Commission and a whole bunch of other government areas and even the indigenous communities in terms of bearing it, doing all. I mean, setting that aside for a moment, you can end up with Germany turning on its coal plants again. Because it's not getting natural gas. You can look to. I can go on a rant about even our own energy issues, and the environmental impact, where we're trying to do everything we can in this country, but you've got third world countries who are just pumping out stuff into the air, and everybody, that's where the emphasis should be. But Keith, wait a second. I mean, the reality was, and I was at the table too, so you were reporting on it, but Greenpeace. Bob Hunter joined, you heard what I said, joined as an advocate. And sure, who wouldn't, pay after a while for him to go and speak about this sort of stuff? He lent his own credibility. But the reality was, what was the alternative? Because it's not solar. Don't give me this. You say horseshit. Don't you give me horseshit about solar being a place to fill that, or coal, or natural gas. I mean, you can't take 45% of the power and sort of say, well, we got to stop it because we can't bury the stuff somewhere. It's a polluting thing. Look,
it's the highest cost energy at the highest risk. No matter how you look at it, the highest cost at the highest risk. I'm not saying it's not a solution. I'm just saying deal with it realistically.
No, but then you don't have a solution, and therefore it's a moot point. I mean, tell me what the alternative would be. I'm
just saying, be truthful, be straight up about the industry is portraying itself in a way it's not. I'm not saying we don't need nuclear power. It provides 50% of Ontario's power.
Right.
Obviously, this needs to be either refurbished or extended to some degree. However they're going to do it, we need to keep or a whole new build. I'm just saying they need to be realistic. They still haven't solved the basic problem of, storing the waste on site or transporting it. When they're still having these sorts of issues, it's nonsense to portray it as a green energy source. But otherwise, it's a reliable energy source, and I'm not saying we don't use it. I just want it to be open about what it is.
But look, let me counter that in a way. The industry would love to be able to get rid of the waste. There have been lots of plans in order to do that. There have been government commissions on it. There's even a nuclear waste a group that looks after this that is government and industry regulated. There have been solutions proposed. There are a whole bunch of things, but they've been protested about and no solutions being made in the last 20 years. I mean, there has been this sort of stuff. The reality was, however, the pushback against actually refurbishing that plant or building new build was the fact that it was considered to be nuclear, potentially radioactive, and a problem for our society, as opposed to something that was then became acceptable as an alternative to coal and gas. So I agree with you that there is at the end of the day, this waste that's left over is a huge problem for the environment and a bunch of other things, unless it gets dealt with. And there's a whole bunch of people outside of us who have to deal with that. But the reality is, at that time, at about 35% support, I think it was 37% support when I took over it. By the time we left with that campaign, it was up around 55%, which is huge in public opinion. And what did it was exactly what's today. Would you rather have coal plants? Would you rather have all that other stuff, or would you rather have this? The ballot question is not, would you rather have electricity or waste that can't be decided upon? I mean, that's the other ballot question. And people are going to say, well, I'd rather have the electricity. So the real issue here is to attack the people who haven't found the solution to it. And it goes back to reconciliation, because, again, you covered it. But what were the objectives? What were the objections to actually bearing it back? Tell me, what were? I know what they were. What were they?
They were on the water. The nuclear plants themselves were on the water. If you bury it on site, there's a danger of the water. The neighboring U.S. states didn't want it in those locations. But just to come around, I don't want to hammer this point home. I do agree we need nuclear energy, whether it's new build or refurbishment. I'm not opposed to either. And when I just went through a four-day power blackout here after the hurricane, and I had the buzz of generators all around, everyone's running their gas-powered generators, I saw a Tesla drive by in my neighborhood, and I thought, did he power that with a gasoline generator overnight? Because we haven't had power for 4 days. So I'm just curious. But again, I'm a little annoyed, I guess, with the nuclear industry itself, but I don't object or even oppose the creation of nuclear energy to keep Ontario at 50% in the mix. It's just absolutely necessary, regardless of how much natural gas, solar, wind, and others we look at. 50% nuke seems to be the baseline for Ontario.
Okay, so let's go to something a little bit more incendiary and talk about the Crosstown. Because you will both know and recall that I spent time working with the Public-Private Partnerships Council, the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships. And this was one of the banners that the P3 advocates were flying high. This was the largest P3 project in Canada at the time when the procurement started. That was back in 2010-ish, 2009. $9.1 billion, I think, was the price tag. And they will shout from the mountaintops how much it saved because of the P3 model. And for those of you who are not up on the P3 model, essentially what it means is the government shares risk with the consortium that takes care of the design, the build, the finance, the maintenance of the project. And in this case, they would have signed off on where that risk stopped for the government and started with the consortium. Typically, delays land on the consortium's desk. This is the second or third time maybe that this contract has been delayed. And if you saw the language from Phil Verster, the CEO at Metrolinx this week, I guess it was last Friday, it was very lawyered. Every word was a lawyered word. And we fully expected that this would be ready by this time and based on the assumptions and the commitments made by the consortium. Here's my issue. People are going to look at this and say, and I'll be the first one to say this, there's something buggered up with the P3 model. And this is a classic case of it going way off the rails, figuratively and literally. In the end, almost sort of similar to the conversation we just had, the P3 model is still the preferable model if you want to save money and get things done on time and on budget. But my guess is that this will be pointed to and saying, we're not doing these anymore. Well, and what's going to happen is you're going to revert to the projects that aren't P3. So the government's going to have all of the risk. The government's going to deal with all of the delays. And the government is going to end up footing the bills. They're going to be higher. There's
only if we elect the NDP again. The Liberals and Conservatives would never go back to anything other than a P3 model. It's just too much upfront cost and risk to government. Yes, this is a bad example. Imagine being a business along Eglinton. 10 years. Oh, now it's going to be 12 years. I mean, it's ridiculous. I think we could point to Union Station. Was that not also a P3 project?
Yep.
That go way over budget, way over time, all these sorts of things. So I don't think that they can be pointing to it until they're done. And then can we say at the end, well, no matter who ran it would have gone over time. It would have gone over budget. Who was on the hook for all that extra money? In the end, was it the taxpayer? Was it the public that ended up paying for all this? I don't know yet with Union. We certainly won't know for a while with Crosstown or with the Eglinton Crosstown. But in the end, maybe that's where the P3 model comes in for its defense, is that in the end, these overruns are picked up by the consortium.
They're supposed to be. They're supposed to be. But that's what, even the 427, Keith, when we extended the 427, they were arguing over painted lines and the quality of the asphalt on that highway and who was going to take responsibility for it. It's that far down in the weeds. So the consortiums are playing the game here in terms of getting the contracts. They're happy to write the check because they get some equity or whatever it is in the project. But at the same time, we're seeing more and more of these awesome delays, and it just means big money at the end of it. So I can see where a government is going to say, to hell with this, we're just going to go back and control the whole thing and take it on. But I will only point to one thing and remind you of the extension of the subway into York Region. That was run by the TTC because they figured, well, we could build a subway. They can't run a bloody subway most days. So, but the government can't be in the business of building. But I'm afraid that this is going to end up costing us more. Infrastructure is just, as a result of what's gone on with Eglinton, we're going to accept the fact that infrastructure is just going to cost us more, and we're willing to put up with it. And that's wrong.
It's 3 blocks from where we live, just up the street. And the most noticeable thing in the last 2 weeks was to drive eastbound on Eglinton. Just before Avenue Road, there's the old Yitz's store. Which, closed down.
Gone out of business,
everything. And you're driving along and suddenly go, wow, something's different here. The hoarding's all down. So the hoarding is all down for the first time across all that stretch of Eglinton, and there's still some pockets of construction. So up to that point. Secondly, the other thing that's happened in Eglinton is that the city has turned it into almost a 2-lane street. That's it. I mean, instead of the 4. So what we now have are these extended giant curbs. We've got bike lanes and everything. And I guess they're expecting that people will take the Crosstown underneath rather than being on top in 4 wheels. It's a transformational circumstance, and with all of the other bike lanes that we see in this neck of the woods that are, I have to say, at this stage are not used. I mean, they're just not used. And then you listen to the mayor who talks about having, these large condo communities, which you can walk in to work from where you are. You can take all, I mean, it may be that we're 15 years behind when that's going to happen. But the amount of construction in this area and across that linkage is going to be massive. Like if you go even further beyond the Don Valley Parkway and see the development that's going in on the north-hand side, unbelievable because of that. So it's creating, it may be creating a significant cost at the moment. And frankly, being this close to it, I have no idea why. And frankly, I think most people don't care because it's like every plan that the government makes to get this kind of transit stuff done is always laughed into about 10 years after the fact. But the reality is that the infrastructure around it now is going to be huge. And if that helps pay off some of that, then that's what it's going to have to be. The developers and everybody else are going to have to pick up part of that tab. I don't hear a hue and cry for getting at it. But we don't know, the specific reasons as to why it is. I'm sure Josh Matlow in this area knows. And we don't know what the cost actually is at the moment and what it's going to end up at. So well,
my guess is that they do not know. There's not a lot of transparency around this. That's the real issue. This is all going on based on the lawyer's interpretation on both sides of where risk begins and risk stops. Whose fault was it that? And that just is adding to the cost. Anyway, I just think that, as we kind of fuss and fart around about what the transit situation looks like along Eglinton, and I appreciate the fact that people who live along there saying, just get it back open again. Let me get back to something that looks like I can walk down the street and go to the market. So there is that, but this whole issue, I think that it's a P3 fail that is actually going to ultimately end up costing more in terms of government infrastructure that gets built in the future. I just don't see it working any other way. I don't care what political stripe you might be. Okay, that'll do it for us. That is On the Ledge. Keith Leslie and John Wright here. And by the way, if you want to listen to the entire conversation I had with Sol Mamakwa, I would encourage you to step over to our Now and Next feed. It's where you get this podcast. And put an ear on it. It's all about what reconciliation means and the harsh realities, the hard truths behind truth and reconciliation. All right, that's On the Ledge for Story Studio Network. Talk to you next week.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.